Welcome Miracles Tribe members and welcome Miracles Attraction community on Facebook. I'm Teresa McGallagher here with my partner, Carly Judd Hardy, and we have another amazing guest for you today in our interview series on people whose lives have been positively transformed by their spiritual practice of A Course in Miracles. Our guest is coming all the way from Canada, Vancouver, and he's Diederik Wolsak. Carly will tell you a little bit about him.
Thank you, Teresa. What a treat it is for us to have you with us, Diederik. Yes, we are so happy to have this interview and be able to present it to people. Teresa was my partner in reading the course, and whenever I was triggered, I would call her up and say, help, help, help. And she loved doing the choose again process with me. So I can say we both benefited. But a little bit about Diederik to start. His journey, and his full name, Diederik Wolsak, his journey started in 1942 on the island of Java in Indonesia. He spent the first 3 years of his life in Japanese concentration camps. Many of his core beliefs were developed during that early, potentially traumatic phase. Then at age 8, he was sent to a foster home in Holland. And by the time he rejoined his parents and brothers 2 years later, he was filled with self-hatred and fear of the world around him. It was the fear, guilt, and self-hatred that translated into prolonged alcohol and drug abuse, till finally at age 50, he reached a point where he realized it was either that there must be a better way or that there would be no point in continuing on. Although the self-hatred had driven him to be a successful businessman and an international athlete, in real life, it allowed him little joy. So following his introduction, or the fork in the road where he decided there must be a change, he entered upon a spiritual path of deep healing. This path eventually led to a fulfilling career as a counselor in private practice. And he can tell us where along this path he encountered the Course in Miracles. But he knows the clients that come to him as a counselor know that they are worthy of respect. They also know from Diederik that they have their own answers. He is just there to assist in finding and removing all blocks to happiness and peace in a most gentle and loving way. They also sense that Diederik has many of the dark places that they see in themselves, that he has a personal knowledge of where there are. So he has, I think in a brilliant way, created a process. It's the 6-step healing process. And it inspired him to create the Choose Again Attitudinal Healing Center. And he now has a book out, and we can hear more about that. Choose Again, the 6 Steps to Freedom. So his natural habitat is working in a circle group with people from all walks of life, guiding them to remove the barriers to love. We're so happy to have you today, take you from that natural habitat to just the two of us and sharing your story. But thank you for being with us, and we'd love to hear all that's going on. Now it's moved to more of an online basis.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carly, and thank you, Teresa, both of you for inviting me to share a little bit about not just my life, but the work that we do. As you mentioned, the 3.5 years in camps were formative, as everybody's first 3.5, 4 or 5 years are formative. And in that time, what happens is you form an identity. And that identity is nothing other than a set of beliefs. It was really, really essential for me to recognize that I wasn't the monster I thought I was. I wasn't any of the diagnoses that I honestly came by based on the DSM-5, from anywhere from borderline personality to chronically depressed to a degree of autism, you name it. I mean, the number of labels that could have been placed on me if I was 15 now instead of 78 is staggering, and they would have been placed on me. And so one of the great fortunes of my life is that I didn't grow up now, that I had the fortune of being 15, 60 years ago, when people didn't know about diagnosis and didn't send people to psychiatrists and didn't pump them full of medication in order to make them behave. And so I had the opportunity to do it differently. Due to the beliefs that I made up during the war, and particularly probably in the 2 years in foster care, which, by the way, was Dickensian in nature. It was remarkable. I was dropped off with people I didn't know, hundreds of miles from where my other family lived in Holland. My parents stayed in Indonesia. And during the 2 years that I was with these wonderful people, I was abused. They stole from me. I couldn't write home. I wrote the first letter saying, this is absolutely horrible, I want to get out of here. Whereupon the wonderful foster mother picked up the letter and sort of delicately shredded it and said, let's do that again. And so for 2 years, I had to report how wonderful it was, while in effect, it was not. So by the time my parents came back from Indonesia and I was 10, I was full of self-hatred and full of devastating core beliefs, which self-hatred, self-loathing, it would be the way to describe it. And that set of beliefs became who I was in the illusion, in the world, in time. Consequently, people didn't like me, which was completely predictable. I have a funny little adjunct with Baron Katie. Baron Katie has a great saying that says, when she walks into a room, she knows that everybody loves her. They don't know it yet. Mine was the opposite. When I walked into a room, I knew that everybody hated me. They didn't know it yet. And because they didn't know it yet, it didn't take me long to behave in a way that it became very clear to everybody in the room that they should hate me. And they did. And so I lived a life of pretty desperate isolation, with substantial alcohol and drug abuse. And that went on and on and on till I was about 50. And somebody gave us A Course in Miracles at that point, that I opened it. And I read, sin is lack of love, as darkness is lack of sin, or lack of light. And I thought, wow, that's what I've always thought to be true. This is remarkable. And then the next line had the Father and the Holy Spirit and the Son. And I said, that's not for me. So I threw the book away. 2 years later, I was completely suicidal. I picked up the place where I was going to drive my car off the road from Vancouver to Whistler. There was one little, maybe 20 or 30 feet where there was no barrier. And I'd stopped the car there and looked down, and went down at least 1,000 feet. So there was no chance of a wheelchair waiting at the bottom of that drop. But I thought, I'm going to give it one more chance. So I said, let me go back to the course. And I opened the course and realized that the course has 365 lessons. And that tells me, because I'm not completely stupid, that it's meant to be a year training. So I said, okay, I'm going to give it a year. And if after a year, my life is not dramatically improved, I can still drive my car off that cliff. That was still an option. But within days, I knew that my life had changed. It was absolutely incredible how fast the course took a hold of how I thought. That didn't mean that I was healed, but it certainly meant that I was completely open to it. I didn't read any of the language that offended me so deeply, like the Father and the Holy Spirit and the Christ and all that stuff that I had a huge resistance to. I didn't see it anymore. I only saw love. So the word God meant love. The word Christ meant love. The word Holy Spirit meant love. It became a very, very simple course for me. And then I got to the point in the course where it teaches that this is a dream, which anybody that has ever read any spiritual text knows that is a universal teaching. This is a dream. But it suddenly hit me with enormous clarity that is only an interesting or a useful point of view if I also accept the fact that I'm the dreamer. Without that, I'm in the dream, I'm a victim of the dream, and the dream does whatever it wants to do with me. And that's how 99% of the people live, because they haven't seen that second part of the statement. Yes, it's a dream, but I am the dreamer. And that changed everything for me. So I moved, at least in theory and at least in understanding, I moved completely out of victim. Doesn't mean that I did no longer have any victim experiences, because the belief that I'm a victim was still alive. So then I realized that in order to make a real difference in my experience on the planet, I would have to foundationally transform who I thought I was. I had to stop accepting the labels that I'd given myself, the labels that I'd made sure everybody else gave me. I had to stop accepting the fact that I had done, yes, I'd done a whole bunch of nasty, horrible, disgusting things, but to read in the course that, yes, that's true, but who you are has not been affected was remarkable. And I never had the feeling of, oh, well, that means that I'm not responsible. Not at all. But it did mean that I wasn't guilty for the rest of my life. It meant that I'd done something I shouldn't have done. Where did that come from? That came from a belief that I hold about myself. I have a little story about that, and a clear demonstration of how that works. Years and years, probably 18 years ago, I was working with a young man who was a crystal meth addict. If you know crystal meth, it's one of the nastiest drugs on the street, and really affects your receptors, your joy receptors in your brain. So crystal meth addicts can no longer receive an experience of joy other than through their chemicals. So that's a horrible, horrible place to be. Anyway, this young man had done really well. He'd done a lot of work, and we'd been working for a year. We had a youth program at the time, and he was one of them. And I was sitting with him in a one-on-one session, and I had my wallet in my back pocket, which I put on the floor next to my chair because I don't like sitting on my wallet. I had to go to the bathroom, and I picked up my wallet. He'd asked me earlier, do you trust me? And I said, absolutely. And then I had to go to the bathroom, and I picked up my wallet and went to the bathroom. And when I came back, he said, this is bullshit. You said you trust me. Why did you pick up my wallet, your wallet? And I said, because you still don't accept your innocence. And as long as you don't, you're going to look for evidence for your beliefs. I'm not going to give you that opportunity. That will be cruel. So once you know who you are, my wallet will be everywhere. I'll leave everything lying around because I know you won't act on it. But till you do. And that was just such an easy and simple, clear demonstration of how none of us have a choice. We don't have free choice. We don't have free will. The only free will I have is to transform the I that I made up, to relinquish the ego. That's the only free choice I have. And if I don't do that, nothing else will ever change. And so out of that experience and through some work with the people we were working with in those days, we developed a 6-step process. And there may be a few people listening who are not familiar with that. So I'll just run through it really quickly. The first step is to acknowledge that you're upset. That in itself is enormously difficult, because if we're honest, and certainly if I'm honest, I recognize that especially 50 years ago, I was in a chronic state of upset. Chronic. Every single moment of the day, there was a ripple of displeasure, discomfort, dislike, whatever it was, irritation, however slight. So step 1 asks me to acknowledge each one of those. So that's a commitment to healing that this process requires. Step 2 is even tougher, because step 2 says, this is about me. This has nothing to do with Corona. This has nothing to do with who is in the White House. This has nothing to do with the fact that I haven't had a decent sushi dinner in about a year. It has nothing to do with anything other than my interpretation. We all know the staggeringly brilliant line in the course that says you're never upset at a fact, you're upset at your interpretation of the fact. But it doesn't really go, the course doesn't, from my point of view, go really into who's the I that made that interpretation. That has to be transformed. Because if I don't transform that I'm going to give that ego, free permission to interpret as it wants the rest of my life. And it will interpret based on who it thinks it is. But that's not who you are. You're not who you think you are. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with me. As you know, we have a center in Costa Rica where people come with depression, anxiety, relationship difficulties, challenges in day-to-day life. And when they arrive at the center, the first thing they hear, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your life. That is not a welcome statement. So we might get something like, haven't you looked at my files? I said, no, I never look at files. Well, didn't you read my stories? I'm not really interested in your story. Well, what am I doing here? What you're doing here is to learn to listen to your story. You are going to learn to listen to your story. You're going to learn to listen to the I that is such a victim and such a perpetrator, because you're both. You cannot be a victim without being a victimizer. So we're both. We're all, absolutely everybody is both. So learning to listen to your own story. I think it's in the pamphlet. I'm not sure where it's in the course, but you have to listen to the dirge you sing and recognize it's you singing it. And once you recognize it's me singing it and it's I that sings it, but who is the I? That's the false I made up 75 years ago. And I've walked around with that nasty little creature for 75 years. And really all it wants is to be told, whatever you made up is not true. So there's a wonderful line in the course, and it's incredibly useful in relationships, is to give each other permission. This is one definition of a holy relationship, where you give each other permission to question what the other believes to be true when they appear to be not happy or at peace. So my partner has the right, we've given each other the right, whenever it seems that I'm not at peace, say, what are you believing right now? Because whatever you're believing is not true because you're not happy. It's so simple. If you're happy, nobody's going to ask you what you're believing because you're just in the truth. Wonderful, stay there. But if you're not happy, you're believing something about you that is not true. So for me, as I said, within days, I felt that my life had dramatically shifted. And before the year was out, I had a full practice as a counselor, which I'd never been. I'm not trained as a counselor. And what happened is that people saw what I was doing, not what I was doing, but they saw the result of what I was doing. And so there were changes being made in my life. And they said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, come and talk. So they would come and talk. And then after a few weeks of people coming and talking, one of them suddenly said, can I give you some money for this? And I said, well, that'd be wonderful. But so they made a $25 donation. And then before you know it, somebody gave me $50. And then one day, this is a funny story. I was working with a couple really early. I think it was the second month that I was doing my work. And the couple was in a mess. They had been separated. And during the separation, according to the wife, the husband had seen a hooker. Well, in the session, he denied it. Absolutely not. I would never do that. Well, I immediately knew he had. And I was just going to wait for him to finally come through. But at the end of it, he said, what do I owe you? And I said, well, I work by donation. So whatever you feel like donating. And he said, I hate that. Why did you just tell me? I said, no, it's by donation. So next week he comes again, and he again denies the whole thing. But at the end, it comes out. He said, yeah, during our separation, I did see a prostitute, but it was only a blowjob. And so at the end of it, he again said, well, there's 2 sessions now. What do I owe you? And I said, it is by donation, but I don't work for less than a hooker. And so he paid me a lot of money. That was my first major payment in a session. Now, a week later, you won't believe this, a week later, I had a prostitute as a client. And I told her the story as a joke. And she said, you go fuck yourself. I won't pay you that much. So we have some idea of what prostitutes earn. So what has become so clear to me is that my healing I mean, we've all heard it a million times, your healing is my healing. But till that becomes true, nothing will happen. I'm not sure where in the course it says, I think it's in the clarification of terms, where it says a teacher of God is someone who somehow has perceived somebody else's interest as his own. So at that moment, you've connected with the oneness, you've connected with the truth that you and I are one, and whatever issue you have, I have. Now, of course, if you spend 25 years working on this 15 hours a day, there are some issues you, a client, may now have that I have resolved. That could be. But you can't have any that I don't recognize intimately. So there's the recognition of the truth, but there's also the recognition of the path. I know what it feels like to be clinically depressed. I know what it feels like to have anxiety attacks. I know what it feels like to have a liquid brain because I drank so much that my brain started sloshing. I know what it feels like to be in Chinatown picking joints out of the gutter. I've done all these things. I've been there. I know what it feels like. I know who the I was that did that. That I is a miserable little bastard. And by learning to ask, who is this I? Lovingly, not with an accusation, not it shouldn't be that way, but obviously it should be that way. Who is this I? Where did that come from? What can we do about that? So then we go to step 3. Having accepted step 2, it's about me. Go to step 3. And step 3 says, what are you feeling? And you may notice, if you were to do our work, that I pay very little attention to feeling from a compassionate point of view, because I really don't care. I know in my work, feeling only has one purpose, and that is to tell me that there's a false I that shows a reaction. So if I'm sad or I'm angry or I'm upset, I'm irritated, whatever it is, that feeling is chosen by the false I. I choose the feelings I experience. Who's the I that chooses it? Certainly not the Holy Spirit. I. That I, the capital S self, only experiences joy. So any other feeling is chosen by the false I. So it's really important to get in touch with your feelings. And that for me, was a huge challenge because I had no idea what I felt. I felt rage or numb. That was my rage. I had no other feelings that I was aware of. So I made a feeling sheet and we've used it and we're still using it for people like me who have trouble feeling, who don't really know what they're feeling. And that feeling sheet has some 64 feelings on it. And I remember, I'll never forget the first time I used it was with a couple, and the gentleman was a minister in a large congregation in a Vancouver suburb, respectable pillar of society. This wonderful pillar of society had an affair for 2 years with his wife's best friend, and she was a little upset about that. And so when she called me, she said, "Is there anything you think we can do about this?" And I said, "What we could do is see if there's any way that you will recognize that this is the best thing that ever happened to you." And she said, "You're either insane or this is going to work." So she came with her husband, and I gave him the feeling sheet. And she, of course, started ticking off feelings. Or no, she didn't. He ticked off 1 or 2 feelings. He looked over to his wife and she was just sitting there, and he ticked off 2 more feelings. He looked over. He was quite proud of himself. He had 5 feelings that he identified, which were, and this is sounding awfully sexist, for a male is a bit of an achievement. But she wasn't doing anything. And so after a few minutes, I turned to her and I said, "I noticed you haven't ticked off any feelings yet." And then she ticked off bored and said, "That's the only feeling I don't have." So she was just one feeling mess. Now, for the purpose of the work, it is essential that you identify your feelings, because each feeling that you identify is chosen by a belief. And so once I identify the feeling, then I say, there is a time when I was little, when I also had that same feeling. I wonder what happened then. I wonder how old I was. And if you stay in the feeling, people say, well, I can't remember back anything before 12. Okay, that's when you start then. It's your earliest memory. It doesn't mean in utero. It can. Doesn't mean your second day on the planet, when you were in your diaper a little longer than you would have liked to be. It can, but it can also be when you're 15. So whatever your earliest memory is, something happened. Somebody did or said something, and you chose to interpret it. And that interpretation became your foundation. The identity that chose that interpretation became your character. In my book, I talk about my foundational story, which is right after the camps. My brother and I received our first toy, and it was a red truck. And we were walking across on a little, I don't know what you would call it, bridge across a fish pond just north of Jakarta on the ocean. And the truck slipped out of my hands, and I could see it. Clearly, it was not deep, and my father would not go in and get it. And the rage that I felt comes up every time my ego tells me you're not supported. Now, of course, that is a belief. So once I healed that belief, and once I recognized that whether you support me or not is irrelevant, I am divinely supported. And once I accept and receive and willingly take in divine support, I will also take in yours. Until I do, your support will mean very little to me. And I have had people say to me, you're so difficult to support. You make it so hard for us to help you. That comes from a belief that I'm not supported. A belief will demand evidence. It is virtually impossible to consistently go against the belief. You can go against the belief once or twice or three times. You look at New Year's resolutions. How long do they last? A week, 2 weeks? For those 2 weeks, you go against your beliefs. And then you say, I can't do it. I'm not going to go to the gym anymore. Not because you don't want to go to the gym, not because you're physically not capable, because you don't deserve to have the benefit. That's your belief. And that's why diet companies they will print money forever, because they don't talk to the people that need a diet about what are you believing when you stuff yourself? What happens when you open the fridge? Your self-hatred kicks in and you start eating. Now I can put you on a diet program, on a regiment of proper eating, but you won't stay with it because it goes against your belief. And that's why people in AA groups have to go to circles all the time, because they're desperately afraid of falling back, because they are going against their belief. They have not healed the belief. I'm not afraid of going into a bar anytime. I used to drink myself silly every single night. Every night I was completely flat out drunk, blind drunk. I can have a beer, I can have a glass of wine, I can go into a bar where other people are drinking a lot. I cannot drink, or I can drink. The fear is not driving it. What is driving it now is I know who I am. I have no desire to kill myself. And that desire to kill myself came from self-hatred. I think we've come to a point where maybe, I don't know, if you have some questions, that will probably be. Any reaction at this point?
No, everything that
I'm
you
in
shared
tears.
is fascinating. And yeah, please continue with the steps so that our listeners can understand how the process completes.
Okay, so we were in the feeling, and we were also at the moment finding out what happened and how old were you. So interestingly enough, when you work with people, in the beginning, I thought, in order for people to be this messed up, something terrible, terrible, terrible must have happened in their life. And we found out that 99% of the cases, it was nothing other than my mother was 5 minutes late picking me up from preschool. That was it. At that moment, I decided nobody loves me, I'm not safe, I'm not taken care of, I don't belong. Boom, boom, boom. The beliefs are in. And it is so remarkable how often that particular, either that or swimming class or violin class, whatever it was, one of my parents was late picking me up. It's a heartbreaking experience to a little person. And so you come to that moment by following the feeling. Oh yeah, that's what I felt. Terribly lonely, terribly abandoned, terribly rejected. What happened? My mom was late. Wow. And it's so wonderful because we work now, of course, with lots of people who have children who now can say when they're 5 minutes late, this doesn't say anything about you. You're perfectly safe. I just had to do X, Y, and Z. That's why I'm a little late. I know you're upset, and here it is. So if you can immediately with a little kid, and it's not, you don't have to be the therapist, but you have to recognize that whatever they're feeling is already chosen by a belief. They already have that belief. So if you're a breastfeeding mother, for example, and you're in the kitchen making dinner and your baby is crying because it's hungry, it happens, and you are in the middle of doing something, you're just going to wait a few more minutes, finish what you're doing in the kitchen, boom, the child decides you don't love her. Not only that, but if it's breastfeeding, my life is at risk here. I'm not being fed when I need to be fed. Now, that doesn't mean that every mother has to hang over the crib with her breast out. That's not what we require. But what it does require is that you teach the child, yes, you're upset. I recognize that. I used to be upset about that too. And now I know it comes from a belief that nobody loves me. That's not true. You are loved. I was just busy in the kitchen. And so if we can raise our children, and children are, to me are where the work is at. I mean, we'll be fine, whatever. But the children, if we don't introduce, teach them how to be their own therapist, how to do their own healing. Therapy literally means growth and healing. So how to be your own therapist. How a 6-year-old, or I'll tell you a little story about that. There's another couple, also early on, who were on the verge of divorce. They couldn't look at each other. They hated each other. They were done. And after the first session, that loosened a bit. After the second session, they walked out hand in hand. And the third session, they asked if they could bring their kids. They had 2 boys, a 4 and 5-year-old, because they couldn't find the babysitter. And I said, fine, bring the boys. Well, the boys were completely out of control. They clearly had not had an experience of discipline from their parents. They just did whatever they wanted. They climbed over me, they climbed over the couch, they were throwing stuff at each other. And it was, from my point of view, an ego assessing the situation, a waste of time. They go home. The father by now has gotten in the habit of meditating. And he's sitting there peacefully meditating, and his little 4-year-old blows up a paper bag, stands next to him, goes boom right next to his head. The father explodes, sends him to his room without dinner. The little 4-year-old comes down the next morning, says to Dad, Dad, last night when you were so angry, that wasn't at me, was it? He picked it up just by being there and noticing what was happening without me ever talking to him directly. A 4-year-old. They knew. It's that quick for little kids. So if we can do that with our little kids, God, it's going to make a difference. And Andrew, who was a huge help in writing my book, wrote a brilliant book on raising children. I think it's called What They Don't Teach You, Raising Healthy Children, What They Don't Teach You in Prenatal Classes. And Andrew, for any of you who have young children, it's a must read, a brilliant book. Then you come to the last step. So at that moment I made up, I'm not supported, let's stick with the red truck. I'm not supported, I'm not loved. Then the forgiveness comes in, and that's forgive me for believing. And you say that to yourself, but you use your loving, your higher self, the Holy Spirit within, as the responder. Forgive me for believing I'm not supported. And then the capital S self within me, which has never been touched. Remember that part that is untouched, untouchable, unchangeable, eternally innocent and safe and love, will say, that's a mistake. You're always supported. You're always loved. Thank God that is true. And then the last step is forgive me for forgetting that I'm divinely supported, that I'm always loved. And the response to that is the truth. I'm glad you remembered. So it's a very loving, gentle process within. And the reason we designed it this way is because I did not want to design or be part of a program or a process that always required somebody else. In the beginning, we used a process that required somebody else to do it with. And to me, it was very tricky because it's very hard to hear stuff if you're not trained and not believe it. That's number one. But number two, it also builds up a dependency. So if, let's say I'm married to Teresa and we have an agreement of a holy relationship, but she's not doing it. Well, then my ego is out of joint and upset, and she won't process, and she should process because look how upset she is. It's got nothing to do with her. My happiness does not depend on her. Lesson 78 has an absolutely breathtaking relationships line that says, she stands in light, I'm in the dark. So if I see my partner is upset and I am upset about that, then my ego wants to fix her so I don't have to be upset anymore. That's got nothing to do with her. My partner's upset. What do I see? I see my mother who was depressed, who wanted to die during the camp years, and it's all my fault. That's what I'm seeing. So my partner's upset, it's my fault. That's how the ego works. There's a brilliant section in the course that says, basically says, whatever upset you have, it's your guilt. Of all the many causes that caused you pain and suffering, your guilt was not amongst them, it says. Because you don't look there. But everything is my guilt. So if I'm worried about what's going to happen, it's my guilt. If I'm worried about whether you're okay, it's my guilt. If I'm worried about whether people will be all right eventually, it's my fault that they're not. And it's astonishing how much guilt we can heap on ourselves and still walk, because the weight of all that guilt is phenomenal. So you see people that are constantly worried about others. That's pure guilt. You say, no, I'm an empath. There are no empaths. I hate to say it, and maybe you want to cut this out later because I'm sure the empaths listening that absolutely love being an empath. There are no empaths. I can only feel what I feel. And I can look at your situation, and what I then do is I can imagine how I would feel in your situation. But I can't. I have no idea how you feel. If you're my twin sister and our parents die, I will have a reaction, you will have a reaction. I will not understand your reaction. And I must refuse to understand. That's the part from true empathy. You must refuse to understand suffering. So whenever you hear somebody say, I know what you feel, run, because they don't. And all they're doing actually is forming a special relationship with you where you feel loved and recognized and seen. And that's what every ego wants. I want to be seen and heard. Yeah, I get that. But who needs to see and hear you? You do. Nobody else does. Nobody needs to see me. Nobody needs to love me. Nobody needs to hear me. Certainly nobody needs to respect me. I do. And once I do, everything else is absolutely wonderful. It all falls into place so beautifully and so easily and seemingly effortlessly. And don't underestimate the amount of effort that's involved to really get into the course. I've only gone through the course maybe 30 times. I would not say I know the course. I love Ken Wapnick saying, if you think you understand the course, read it again. It's just such an immensely, profoundly psycho-spiritual teaching that I don't think I'll ever be finished with, apart from the fact that I absolutely love the language, which makes me a rare creature on the planet. But I love the language of the course. I love Shakespeare, can't help it. Questions?
We just really appreciate you spending your time to share all of this wisdom with us, Diederik. And we want you to tell our listeners where they can find you. You have a website?
Yeah, our website is www, a whole bunch of w's.choose-again.com. That's our organization, and the organization has grown in a most phenomenal way. 4 years ago, or 3.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. And so I stepped back. I was also completely exhausted and broken down physically from working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 25 years. apparently that's not good for you. I figured a little late, I discovered that that's not the way to treat your body. Maybe that was still a little bit of self-hatred, who knows? Anyway, it's now, the wonderful, wonderful staff stepped in, and Choose Again is now run by Gadi and Freddie and Claudia and my daughter Saskia and a whole bunch of other people who have developed incredible online programs. I think we're offer circles at least once a day, if not more often, at any part of the world. And so go to the website. Don't go to my website necessarily, because I'm very, very bad, as Teresa knows, at answering emails. I think you sent me the first email, 3 or 4 months ago, and it took me that long to respond. And this happened about 2 weeks ago. I said, okay, I know that since the middle of December, I haven't answered any real emails. So I went back to the middle of December. And so eventually I got up to yours. But that behavior, for example, is still the outcome of a belief. Because how do people feel when I don't answer their emails? Well, they're not happy with me. So at a deep level, that's what I'm looking for. There's absolutely no reason why I couldn't, maybe I get a dozen emails a day, big deal. There's no reason why I couldn't answer every single one of those within an hour, but I don't. So what is that about? What am I looking for? I'm looking for a rejection still, even after all this work, at a deep level. That's one interpretation, and that interpretation would be valid if it bothered me. But unfortunately, it doesn't really bother me. So it's not my belief. It's just what I do. I'm just not a great email answerer.
Well, we're so grateful that you did answer my email and that we were able to have you as our guest today. We will post the link to your website above this video and some information about your book so that people can find the Choose Again process and use it. And we just really want to let you know how much we appreciate what a light you are in the world.
Thank you so much. I just want to say a few words about the book. The book is really designed for the huge, vast majority of people that cannot afford to go to Costa Rica, that cannot afford to get one-on-one sessions, that don't have time to go to circles. I am absolutely convinced that if you read the book and a couple of times and start practicing it, there's tons of exercises in it, there's tons of real case studies of real life examples of how people's experience just transformed so quickly. If you don't have the opportunity to join with other people like you have, where you have your community, if you don't have that, the book will serve you beautifully. It's doing remarkably well. That it was published in Holland, where it now sells at a ridiculous level. It's about to be published in German. It's going nicely, and I really would like it to go as far as possible, because we can't reach people, that many people. I mean, one-on-one, you and I, the three of us can spend an hour together, that's 3 people. But books go out, that's thousands of people without really any effort on anybody's part except the one reading it, who pretty quickly will determine that this will change your life. The 6-step process, from my point of view, and it's nothing to do with me. Let me make that absolutely clear. It's not my process. I have a good friend in Switzerland who 2 years ago, he's a Course in Miracles student, and he emailed me saying, I'm really curious, where do you find the 6-step process in the course? So I send them, I think, 84 quotes. And that was just that I found in 5 minutes. I mean, the course is nothing other than teaching the 6-step process. That's really what it's about.
Well,
Cool.
even so,
Beautiful. Thank you.
even so, we appreciate you sharing it with us.
However it
because,
came to you.
yes, the course can seem very dense.
It was
to many
wonderful to
people.
meet you finally.
Thank you.
The
We hope
course
to
is
see
in
you
what?
again.
Sorry? We'll do it again. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you, Diederik. Yes.
Bye-bye.